A little bit of a pivot here. Tell us about For All Moonkind. How does it fit into this picture of an evolving legal regime and regulatory structure?
So For All Moonkind was started basically because I was aghast that our Apollo lunar landing sites were not protected by any law or regulations. They're not even recognized as anything special. Anybody can go up to the moon and erase the boot prints and the rover tracks, or, the object remains a United States object. So presumably, if somebody were to take the plaque off, right, and come back to Earth with it, the United States would try and stop them from selling it. But I don't know if you recall, Frank, back in 2017, 2018, oh no, it was 2019. It was the anniversary. Somebody had the first bag. It was the bag that Neil Armstrong used to get the very first lunar samples. NASA had control of the bag, and then they lent it to a museum to exhibit it. And then the museum, unfortunately, went bankrupt. The proprietor of the museum was shady, and the bag ended up in an auction, and a woman bought the bag for $800.
Yeah.
Okay, so that bag, then she sent it to NASA to say, "Is this legit?" And NASA said, "Yes, thank you so much for returning it." And she said, "No, no, 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 I paid $800 for that." It went to court, and this is one of those opinions from the judge that you read, and you can almost hear the judge just crying because he's like, "NASA, I don't know how you did it, but I cannot get this bag back to you. She owns it. That trail of ownership, it is definitely in her hands." So she sold it for $2.7 million, and then sued NASA again later, saying NASA kept some of the microscopic pieces of the lunar dust, and that depressed the price of the bag. And so think about that. So think about the fact that this bag, $2.7 million. This is the very first bag that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin brought back, and NASA lost it. And so, this is what we're looking at. This is the future we're looking at as we're having 100, 200 missions to the moon in the next decade. Uh, we have no idea who's going to go close to one of the Apollo sites. So that's why we started For All Moonkind, because that's just ridiculous. Those should be protected sites. Eddie Bernice Johnson, representative from Texas, actually introduced a bill that would have made them national parks, which of course violates international law because you can't claim territory in space.
Right.
And this is actually the issue, because how do we protect this heritage without claiming territory?
Right.
And remember, I told you Article 1 says freedom of access to all areas of celestial bodies.
Right.
So protection violates the treaty.
Right.
And we formed to figure out that conundrum and figure out a way to protect these sites. And it's not just Apollo, it's Chang'e and Luna, a lot of Luna sites, 2 Lunicod rovers. So what we learned, we formed in 2017. In the evolution, I realized, wow, this is one of the only things we actually agree on Earth, protecting heritage. 193 nations have ratified the World Heritage Convention. So why wouldn't people agree to
Yeah.
protect heritage in space? And when I went to the United Nations, not one country, and I talked to Russia and China and Iran, Venezuela, not one country said, "That's a dumb idea." They all said, "Yeah, that's a great idea, but it's too hard to do." And so For All Moonkind, we're working through the hard part. We're really thrilled. We in 2020 we developed and saw the passage of the One Small Step Act, which is the first national legislation in the world to recognize we have heritage in outer space. And then, of course, the Artemis Accords, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. they have it Section 9, which also recognizes that there is heritage in outer space. And 29 nations have now signed that, essentially saying that, okay, we agree that there's heritage in outer space. So what does that mean for people who want to mine the lunar surface, for investors? It matters because this is a starting point for understanding how we're going to behave towards each other in space. If we can figure out a way to prevent access to these heritage sites, then that would be a really good model to protect operational sites. And so that's why it's important what we're doing.
As you're speaking, it occurs to me there could be sites on Mars that could be heritage sites in the sense of there are rovers and other human artifacts on Mars. There's never been a human landing, but there will be, and that could be a very similar type of heritage that we haven't given much thought to as yet. So, yeah.
Exactly. And we do want to protect heritage in all of outer space, but we're really focused on the moon because that's where everyone's going back right now. And I also want to point out, Frank, there's the flip side, which is why we really need to solve this problem, is if a nation decides that it has heritage somewhere, right? And they say, then what is to stop them from saying, we need a protective zone of about 30 kilometers. So, that's heritage. It's got to be protected to honor our heritage, 30 kilometers. We need to have norms and standards with respect to, so that everybody can agree, okay, no, it can only be, no more than 2 kilometers or whatever we feel it needs to be.
And then in the introduction, I mentioned that For All Moonkind has formed the Institute for Space Law and Ethics, which sounds like a broader mandate than what we've been discussing. What led you to decide to take on this rather large task?
So I have been, reading a lot and listening to a lot of people talk. There are real life space ethicists out there, and they are brilliant and wonderful, but very daunting and very, everything that I was reading about space ethics was, just we can't take colonialism with us. We need to stop colonialism. And it's all very forward looking. This is what our communities are going to look like. We need to make them more diverse, and, all really, really useful and thought provoking ideas. But nobody's thinking about the ethics of today. They're all thinking about, what it's going to look like 100 years from now. I wanted to really focus on the ethics of today because this is what is going to be the foundation of the future. And yes, we expanded beyond heritage because I think I saw a real need. Nobody's talking about this. What does it mean to be ethical as you explore space today? Forget the communities and so forth. And I think it's really important because what I really want to see is I don't want to see UN regulations and US regulations. I want to see the people who are going to space agreeing to standards. I think it's really important for the commercial industry to take the lead here. If the commercial industry can be ethical and responsible, and prove that, then we won't need regulation. Or then at that point, the regulation just becomes the norm that the commercial industry has created. And so if we can help push that along by identifying sort of base ethical standards, don't get too close to another satellite. Sure, the law says you have 25 years to deorbit your satellite, but maybe you ought to deorbit it sooner so that we can keep our orbit clean, and sort of find those ethical things that everybody can agree on.
And this is a reason why investors and entrepreneurs and even big aerospace companies that are well established really ought to take this question of ethics seriously. It may seem esoteric, but when you stop projecting into the future and talk about what's happening today, it's highly relevant. And the more that the industry concerns itself with these issues, the less likely that regulations or opposition will come about that will, in fact, create a difficult economic climate for everyone who's trying to do things today. Am I right? Is that how you see it?
That's exactly right, Frank. And I should say I'm so grateful that you agreed to join our effort. Um, this is an opportunity again for commercial industry to show the world that they can be responsible, and and it's not hard. There are some very basic precepts that I think uh, people will follow anyway. I mean, you don't want to go out and destroy your competitor's satellite, right? You want to give them some respect. You want to have that same respect accorded to you. It's almost like going back to the basics of human behaviors and how humans relate to each other. I honestly believe, ultimately, when we do look at that 100-year horizon, I think states are gone. I think we will be in a different kind of system than the sovereign system. And so it's really important for the humans who are looking at this right now to be very responsible in what they're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you mentioned, and as this podcast illustrates, my work in the space field for a long time has been as an advocate of space exploration and development, space migration, etc., uh, space philosophy, if you will. And at this point, working with Introact, I am very, very engaged in what the private sector is doing. And most of the people I've met want to be ethical about it, and they have a dream of improving humanity and improving life. And so I do believe there's a will to do that, and maybe the institute can set some guidelines as to how to make that happen. Maybe you could comment too on something I know we've talked about at the institute, which is what is the relationship of law and ethics, because that's really part of the institute mandate. But as we've discussed, there are things that can be ethical uh, and legal. There can be activities that are legal, but some people would say they're not ethical, and suddenly it doesn't seem so simple. So, what's your view on that?
That is a very tough question when you think about the relationship between law and ethics. And it's very easy to say, oh, the ethics come first and then you have the law. But we know that both evolve constantly, right? And as you said, all too often we do have laws that turn out to be unethical or were unethical when they were passed. And so when we look at the relationship between ethics and law, what we would like to do is again capture the ethical baseline, and that is very difficult across different cultures and communities, right? It was very difficult in the United States, but that ethical baseline then can be the basis for your law. And when we talk about an ethical baseline, again, it's going to evolve into that law. The way we have in the law, we also have this concept of customary international law. No law has to be made, no treaty has to be signed for certain things. For example, the freedom of exploration and use of space is considered customary international law because when, as everybody knows, a country has sovereign rights over its airspace. And so nobody can cross into that airspace, pretend you have a fence going all the way up to the atmosphere. And it was sort of debated whether you also have sovereignty over the space above you. And some countries, like the Soviet Union, said, yes, we ought to own all the way to the heavens. And then we were in the space race, and the Soviet Union put Sputnik up the first satellite to orbit the Earth. Interesting thing happened. President Eisenhower made the decision not to object to the passage of Sputnik over the United States. and no other nation objected. And thus it became, we call it instant customary international law, that there shall be freedom of navigation and exploration if you're in space. There will be no sovereign boundaries in space. Um, it, Anecdotally, it has been suggested that President Eisenhower actually slowed down our program so the Russians would be first, so that he would have the opportunity not to object. And if you look at, the Russians, the Soviet Union also was the first country to land an object on another celestial body with their Luna 2 in 1959. And the Luna 2 was actually had a ball of medallions. And the idea was that when the ball impacted the moon, the medallions would spread out. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, maybe because you'd want to claim territory, like that's my medallion there. So the Soviet Union did actually object to the concept of the freedom of exploration and use of space. They messed up. I think they were moving too quickly, and they started to argue, oh no, it should only be for scientific purposes, but the custom was made. And so that is what we're looking at now. Now, traditionally, custom is made by states. It's state practices, but custom can be made by commercial entities. And again, this is what's so important in space when you're dealing with technology, with these new domains. Whereas usually for custom, you need to have centuries and centuries of this is what people did or whatever.